NATO spent decades building air defenses for the kind of threats that look terrifying on paper. Advanced fighter jets, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. The problem is that the battlefield changed faster than that logic did, because in the last few years, modern war has been flooded by a different kind of threat, cheaper, smaller, easier to mass produce, and in many ways far more dangerous to the economics of defense itself. The drone age did not just introduce a new weapon, it exposed a weakness inside one of the most sophisticated military architectures on Earth. And once you see that weakness clearly, the numbers start to look almost absurd. Multi-million-dollar interceptors are being used against drones that cost a tiny fraction of that to build. Some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world are being pulled into battles where the math simply does not hold. You can destroy the target, yes. But if the cost of stopping the threat is wildly higher than the cost of producing it, then over time you are not solving the problem. You are bleeding into it. That is why what happened in Poland matters so much. Because this is not just a story about one new counter-drone system or one successful field deployment. It is a story about a defense world that has known for years that it has a gap, struggled to close it, and then watched a small Swedish team move faster than almost anyone thought possible. Not in 8 years. Not after a giant procurement cycle. In 84 days. And that is what makes this story bigger than Saab, bigger than Poland, and even bigger than drones alone. Because if a practical fix to one of NATO's most expensive military problems can be built that quickly by rethinking what already exists, then the real question is no longer just how to stop drones. The real question is whether the future of warfare will belong to the militaries that build the most advanced systems, or the ones that learn how to adapt before the battlefield changes again. Before we get to NATO's problem, we need to understand what the drone age has actually done to modern warfare. Because the real shock is not simply that drones are everywhere now. It is that they are no longer supporting the battlefield from the margins. In just a few years, they have moved into the center of how wars are fought, how pressure is applied, and how expensive military power is forced to respond. You can see that shift across multiple theaters at once. In Ukraine, drones are no longer just reconnaissance tools feeding intelligence back to artillery units. They are strike platforms, attrition tools, psychological weapons, and low-cost systems of constant pressure. Small quadcopters can harass frontline positions. One-way attack drones can travel deep behind the front and hit infrastructure, logistics hubs, and energy targets. Cheap commercial platforms can be modified in ways that would have sounded improvised a decade ago, but now represent a normal part of battlefield adaptation. What used to look like a niche capability has become one of the defining features of the war itself. And Ukraine is not the only place proving that point. In the Persian Gulf and the wider Middle East, drones have become instruments of coercion, signaling, and disruption. They are used to threaten shipping probe defenses, stretch response capacity, and create pressure at a cost far below that of the systems sent to stop them. This is what makes the drone age so dangerous. It is not just that drones can hit targets, it is that they can force stronger militaries into responses that are economically unsustainable if repeated often enough and at sufficient scale. That is the real revolution. Drones have changed the relationship between cost and effect. A platform that may be relatively cheap to build can now force a state to react with systems, logistics, manpower, and readiness levels that cost dramatically more. And once that happens at scale, the question is no longer whether drones are effective. Of course they are. The real question is what kind of defense architecture can survive a battlefield where the attacker's economics start looking smarter than the defenders. Because that is the part many military institutions were slow to grasp. They understood drones as a growing threat, but they did not fully understand how quickly drones would become a mass-produced, constantly evolving, cost-imposing threat. And once that happened, it was no longer enough to have great air defenses in the traditional sense. You also needed air defenses that made economic sense in the kind of war the world is now entering. And that is exactly where NATO's problem begins. Now we get to the core of NATO's problem, and once you see it clearly, the logic behind the current scramble for counter-drone systems becomes impossible to ignore. NATO's air defense architecture was built to stop high-end threats. Cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, advanced aircraft, and other targets that justify the use of highly sophisticated interceptor systems. In that world, spending millions of dollars to destroy a single incoming threat makes strategic sense because the threat itself is expensive, rare, and potentially catastrophic if it gets through. The equation is harsh, but it works. The drone age broke that equation. Because now the defender is increasingly being challenged not only by high-end weapons, but by low-cost systems that can be built, quickly deployed in volume, and used again and again to force reactions. This is where the economics of modern air defense start to look deeply uncomfortable. A high-end interceptor may still destroy the target exactly as designed. Technically, the defense works. But economically, the exchange can be disastrous. If a defender spends millions to stop something that costs only a small fraction of that to produce, then over time, the attacker begins shaping the battle through cost alone. That is not a theoretical concern anymore. It is already visible in the way militaries have been forced to respond to drone saturation. The problem is not one cheap drone by itself. The problem is repetition. The problem is scale. The problem is that a system that is tolerable when used once becomes strategically exhausting when used dozens or hundreds of times in sequence. A military can survive a bad exchange rate in a single engagement. It cannot build an entire defensive posture on one. And that is why the old answer is no longer enough. NATO still needs Patriot-class systems. It still needs the upper tier of air defense for the threats those systems were designed to defeat. But it also needs another a layer built for volume, for speed, for persistent low-cost harassment, and for the simple reality that not every target should trigger a $1 million response. This is the part the drone age exposed so brutally. Modern defense is no longer only about whether you can shoot something down. It is about whether you can afford to keep doing it when the attacker is trying to drain you by design. Once that becomes the battlefield logic, the search for a new kind of answer is no longer optional. It becomes urgent. And that urgency is exactly what turned a counter-drone gap inside NATO into one of the most important defense problems in the alliance today. But here is what makes the problem even more serious. NATO is not facing a drone challenge in some distant, limited, or experimental form. It is facing the arrival of drone warfare at industrial scale. The issue is not simply that drones are effective. It is that they can now be produced in large numbers, adapted quickly, and used in repeated waves that put sustained pressure on even sophisticated defenses. That changes everything. Because once low-cost systems can be launched in volume, the defender is no longer responding to isolated threats. It is responding to a production model. You can already see that model taking shape across multiple wars. Russia has expanded drone production dramatically. Ukraine has done the same under wartime conditions. Iran has established itself as one of the most important drone exporters in the world. And every major military power watching these conflicts is drawing the same lesson. Cheap, scalable, rapidly adjustable unmanned systems are no longer side tools. They are becoming central to how attrition, disruption, and strategic pressure are applied in modern war. The future threat is not one drone. It is the combination of scale, repetition, and adaptation. That is why the counter-drone race has accelerated so fast. Defense planners understand the danger. Budgets are growing. Research pipelines are full. Companies across the world are rushing to offer solutions from jammers and guns to interceptor drones, specialized missile sensors, and directed energy concepts. On paper, the response looks massive. But scale of effort does not automatically produce clarity of answer. In fact, it can sometimes expose the opposite. The more systems appear, the more obvious it becomes that the defense world still is not fully settled on what an economically sustainable, operationally practical answer is supposed to look like. And that is the real significance of this moment. NATO is not short on money. It is not short on companies. It is not even short on counter-drone concepts. What it has been short on is a clean solution that can be fielded quickly, integrated easily, and used at the tempo this new battlefield demands. That is a very different problem from lacking technology. It is a problem of matching the speed of adaptation on the battlefield with the speed of adaptation inside the defense system itself. And once you understand that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the drone age is scaling faster than traditional procurement can respond, then who is actually capable of building the kind of answer this moment requires? That is where Sweden enters the story, and not as the kind of defense giant people usually imagine when they think about military transformation. The reason Sweden mattered here was not because it had the biggest budget, the largest industrial base, or the most glamorous procurement culture. It mattered because it had something that turned out to be far more useful for this problem. A defense philosophy built around practicality, reliability, and systems that are meant to work under pressure rather than simply impress on paper. That distinction matters more than it may seem. In a procurement culture shaped by long timelines and ambitious development cycles, there is often a strong temptation to solve new problems with entirely new programs, new platform, new architecture, new bureaucracy, new years of waiting. But the drone age is punishing that instinct. It is rewarding the organizations that can move quickly, combine what already exists, and focus on whether the answer can be fielded in time to matter. Sweden's defense industry, and Saab in particular, was unusually well positioned for that kind of moment. Saab has spent decades building a reputation not around spectacle, but around usable military tools, systems that are modular, systems that can be maintained, systems that are trusted because they solve real operational problems. That reputation is not accidental. It reflects a way of thinking that fits the drone problem almost perfectly. If the challenge is moving too fast for traditional development cycles, then the smartest response may not be invention from zero. It may be recombination. It may be recognizing that the shelf already contains most of what you need if you are willing to connect it differently. And that is exactly what makes this such an important shift. The answer did not begin with a futuristic breakthrough or a revolutionary weapon that changed the physics of the battlefield overnight. It began with a different kind of question. What already exists that can be turned into a practical response right now? That question sounds simple, but in the modern defense world it is almost radical, because it prioritizes speed over prestige, integration over perfection, and usefulness over theatrical innovation. That is why Sweden was able to move in a way that larger and better funded defense systems often struggle to. It was not chasing an ideal future solution. It was recognizing that the battlefield had already changed, and that a good answer available now could matter more than a perfect answer delivered years too late. And once that logic takes hold, the story stops being just about Sweden or Saab. It becomes about whether the rest of NATO is prepared to think that way too. This is where the answer itself comes into focus. Not as a miracle weapon and not as some futuristic system that depends on technology the battlefield cannot yet support, but as something far more important, a practical response built for the math of the drone age. The logic behind it is surprisingly simple. If the threat is low cost, fast to produce, and difficult to stop economically with top-tier interceptors, then the defense needs to be layered, modular, and affordable enough to respond repeatedly without exhausting itself. That is what makes this kind of system different. It is not trying to replace the highest layer of air defense. It is filling the gap beneath it, the layer where drone warfare is doing its real damage. The answer is not one device doing one thing. It is a connected system built around detection, tracking, engagement, and disruption. First, you need to find low, slow, small targets quickly and reliably. Then you need a response that does not force you into a million-dollar decision every time something cheap enters the battle space. And ideally, you need more than one way to neutralize the threat. That is why this approach matters. Radar handles the problem of awareness. A stabilized weapon station handles the problem of fast, accurate engagement. Electronic warfare adds another option by attacking the drone's ability to function at all. Taken together, that creates something much more useful than a single-purpose countermeasure. It creates a defense package that can adapt to different drone types, different attack patterns, and different levels of urgency without forcing the operator into the same response every time. And that flexibility is exactly what the drone age demands. Some threats should be physically destroyed. Some can be jammed. Some require immediate action. Others can be tracked and managed differently depending on the environment. The key is not just having firepower, it is having choices that make tactical and economic sense at the same time. That is the hidden strength of a modular counter-drone system. It gives the defender room to think instead of forcing every engagement into the most expensive possible lane. So the real significance of the fix is not that it introduced an entirely new technological category. It is that it combined existing capabilities into a form that finally matches the battlefield logic drones have created. This was not a miracle system. It was a system built for the math of the drone age. And once that becomes clear, the next question is no longer whether the concept makes sense. It is how something like this moved from problem recognition to fielded capability in a matter of weeks. What turns this from an interesting defense project into something far more consequential is the speed. In the modern military world, speed is not just an advantage, it is often the dividing line between relevance and irrelevance. Traditional procurement systems were built for another era, an era when threats evolved more slowly, development cycles stretched across years, and a weapon could still arrive in the field before the battlefield had fundamentally changed around it. That world is fading. Drone warfare has accelerated the tempo of adaptation so aggressively that a system delivered too late can be technically impressive and still strategically obsolete. That is why the 84-day timeline matters so much. Not simply because it is fast, but because it exposes how misaligned much of the old defense process has become with the realities of modern war. In the traditional model, solving a new problem often means launching a new program, defining new requirements, creating new layers of review, and waiting while bureaucracy catches up with urgency. That process may produce polished results. It may produce highly capable systems. But in a battlefield environment where the threat is learning and real-time speed itself becomes a form of capability, if the defender cannot adapt at the pace of the attacker's innovation, then part of the battle is already being lost before the system ever arrives. What makes this case remarkable is that the timeline was compressed not by cutting corners on the problem, but by asking a different question about how to solve it. Instead of treating the challenge as an invitation to start from zero, the system was built by integrating what already existed, reducing development drag, and focusing on what could be fielded quickly enough to matter. Now, that logic sounds obvious in hindsight. In practice, it runs directly against the habits of many large defense institutions. Those institutions are often optimized for refinement, not acceleration. They know how to build extremely sophisticated systems. They do not always know how to move at the speed the drone age demands. And that may be the hidden lesson here. The real breakthrough is not just the hardware, it is the tempo. A military alliance can have all the money, industrial depth, and engineering talent in the world and still find itself outpaced if its process is built for a slower century. 84 days does not just represent a successful project timeline, it represents a warning. The future of defense may depend less on who can design the most impressive system on paper and more on who can recognize a battlefield problem, integrate a workable answer, and put it into real hands before the threat evolves again. And once that point lands, the next question becomes even more important. Speed is impressive, but did it actually work when it mattered? And that is where the story stops being theoretical, because a fast timeline and a smart design are impressive, but neither means very much unless the system can prove itself in an environment where failure would actually matter. That is what makes the Poland deployment so important. This was not a controlled showroom demonstration or a polished defense expo reveal. It was an operational setting tied to NATO security-based protection and the defense of infrastructure linked to the wider war effort around Ukraine. That changes the meaning of the system immediately. Once a counter-drone platform is placed in a location connected to real alliance logistics and real security responsibilities, the question is no longer whether the concept sounds promising. The question becomes whether it can perform under pressure over time against the kind of drone activity that has already become a defining feature of modern conflict, and this is where the proof begins to matter more than the pitch. Because what made the deployment significant was not just that the system was present, it was that it produced measurable results. Over the course of its operational use, it successfully intercepted dozens of drones, including both quadcopter-type threats and fixed-wing UAVs. That matters for a simple reason. The drone challenge is not uniform. It comes in different forms with different flight profiles, different behaviors, and different tactical uses. A system that can only handle one category cleanly is useful but limited. A system that can demonstrate effectiveness across multiple categories starts to look much more relevant to the kind of layered defense environment NATO actually needs. And there is another reason this matters. Operational proof cuts through a huge amount of noise in the defense world. Brochures can promise anything. Concepts can sound transformative. Demonstrations can be carefully staged. But repeated interceptions in a real deployment tell a different story. They suggest the system is not merely technically possible. They suggest it is usable. And in the drone age, usability may be just as important as sophistication. A defense platform that works under operational conditions that crews can actually run and that can be deployed without waiting years for refinement has a very different kind of value from one that looks perfect only in theory. That is why Poland matters so much in this story. It transformed an argument into evidence. It showed that this was not just a clever integration of existing components, but a fielded answer with real defensive utility. And once you have that kind of proof, the conversation changes. The issue is no longer whether a practical answer to NATO's drone problem can exist. It is what this says about how the alliance may need to build, deploy, and trust defensive capability from this point forward. So here is the bigger takeaway. The story of this system is not just the story of one successful counter-drone platform, one smart Swedish team, or one unusually fast deployment cycle. It is the story of what modern warfare is beginning to reward. Not just technological sophistication in the abstract, but speed, practicality, modularity, and the ability to translate a battlefield problem into a fielded answer before the threat evolves again. That is why this matters far beyond Poland. Because the drone age is not waiting for military institutions to feel ready. It is forcing them to choose between two models of defense. One model still believes the answer will come from larger programs, longer timelines, and more polished systems arriving after the problem has already changed shape. The other model starts with urgency, accepts imperfection, and prioritizes what can be built, integrated, and trusted quickly enough to matter in the real world. And that distinction may define far more than counter-drone warfare. It may define which militaries remain relevant in the next phase of conflict. LOKI may not be the final answer to the drone age, no single platform is, but it may be one of the clearest signs yet that the old tempo of defense is no longer enough. Because the drone age did not just create a new threat, it exposed which militaries can still change fast enough to survive it.
Disclaimer, this video is fictional storytelling created for education, commentary, and entertainment. It is not a factual report or official information. Any similarities to real events are coincidental. Please enjoy it as creative content only.